Hey, how you doing? It's SJ Bennett, also known as Qualism, and you are watching a test animation of Pointy from A Moment in the Sun, my first computer animated short. This shot features Pointy sticking a finger up accusingly at the camera, which represents Gronky, the protagonist of the piece. And Pointy is hassling Gronky about having such a big shadow, which is a perfectly natural thing for a large character to have. I'll just point out that bone that I've got selected at, like right now. That's hooked up to a lattice, which basically means if I move that around, I get a lot of character animation just by moving one single bone. That's a feature of Pointy's rig. I thought about doing it for Gronky, but decided not to in the end. It would just make Gronky look too elastic, and that's not the kind of look I want to go for with the character. So the animation test is partly to figure out if the rig is going to disappoint and betray me during production. There are some ways in which it is a little bit of a handful, and I can go back and change the rig and hopefully fix up the problems that I'm having during animation. But also just to sort of, get used to animating, figure out how Pointy moves, and getting used to the rig in general. Although it's effectively taking Pointy out for a quick spin around the block just to make sure that he works as advertised. And after this, taking him back into the garage for a few repairs. So what I'd like to talk about here, which I think is probably more important, is everything I've been doing outside of Blender for the last couple of days, namely figuring out a voice for Pointy and recording dialogue, and even rewriting that dialogue, tweaking it slightly once I'd figured out exactly where Pointy was coming from as a character. Now, to an extent, this was working from the outside in. I had my storyboards, I knew what Pointy was going to do, I had all the action set out. What I hadn't really thought about in any great detail yet, possibly because Pointy is a horrible, horrible character, is why he's doing what he's doing from his own perspective. And in the end, the big character revelation is that Pointy is just doing what he's doing because he's a horrible psychopath, he's a bully, and he likes playing mind games with people. He goes up to Gronky and tries to make him ashamed that he has a large shadow, as though that's anything that Gronky has any control over. So what that left me with was a small, scrappy, tenacious, mean, manipulative, controlling, evil jerk. And that is really good information to have and to be able to work with, because it cuts certain possibilities off. So knowing that he's sort of evil and aggressive, you can automatically say, okay, well, he's not going to be happy when he walks up to Gronky and starts saying all this horrible stuff. He's probably going to come on really, really strong. Okay, is he going to be subtle about it, or is he going to be very upfront? Is he going to chuckle and, grimace and kind of sneer, or is he just going to be really, really kind of angry and intense? And that really led to trying different takes, different options, different readings of different lines. And what I arrived at in the end was this character who says these terrible, weird things with complete conviction and intensity and focus and purpose. And does he believe these things that he's saying? I don't think that actually matters. I mean, the story is about him trying to convince Gronky that his shadow is too big, so whether he believes it or not is kind of immaterial. If he doesn't believe it, then he is not the kind of character that's going to throw a wink to the audience and say, haha, I'm just messing with this guy. And if he does believe it, he's not going to throw that wink to the audience anyway, because there is no wink to throw. So, like I said, immaterial. That whole psychopath interpretation I talked about is just a way for me to unlock the character so that I can voice him, so I can move him around, but that's not the only interpretation, and what I'm taking as a more important point is the whole absurdity of the story, where a smaller character tells a larger character that their shadow is too big. And thinking of the smaller character as a psychopath, well, if it gets the film made, then I'll go with what works. That said, I'm a big fan of ambiguity, so if after watching the finished film you decide that Pointy is actually really, really dumb and that Gronky is in fact some sort of Zen master, then you can go with that. I'm perfectly happy with that interpretation too. I'll just drift back to what's on screen here for a second. What I'm doing here is just pulling the head right up for a big beat in the dialogue. So the two bits of dialogue you can see represented as blobs on that waveform there. The first bit is, "Hey you!" And the second bit is, "Do you realize how much sun you're using up?" So that's what pointy sounds like, and that is why I didn't record any sound for this particular time lapse, because you do not want to hear that over and over and over again for 90 minutes. You don't want to hear that over and over again for 11 minutes even, sped up. And what you really, really, really don't want to hear over and over again for 11 minutes sped up is the computer processed version, which is pitch shifted up slightly and then put through a speak and spell resynthesis plugin that I've got for my digital audio workstation. And his final voice is just a work of evil genius. You know from the second that he opens his mouth that he's going to be a giant pain in the ass for someone, namely Gronky. Now, I did record the whole process of coming up with Pointy's voice, so sort of starting with a stock character, who incidentally sounds kind of like this, it's just something I can pull out of the air when I need to. And taking that and turning it into the most obnoxious sound in the universe. My suspicion is people watching this video will be interested in Blender, they'll be interested in CG, they'll be interested maybe in character design, but they won't necessarily be interested in other stuff like screenwriting, coming up with character voices and all that sort of stuff. So I freely accept that not everyone who makes a CG film has the time, energy, interest, arrogance, hubris to put themselves in a position where they're responsible for making every single part of that film, visual, auditory, or otherwise. So that's the position I've put myself in, and if you are interested in hearing me come up with that character voice, if you're interested in hearing lots of outtakes, recordings, and actually a fair bit of profanity, please leave a comment, let me know, and I'll get it up online. Now you might wonder, where's the story reel? The story reel, if you're wondering, is the storyboard set out and timed to a temporary soundtrack. Well, the reason that you haven't seen the story reel yet is that it doesn't exist. Because the soundtrack doesn't exist. Because I haven't written it yet. Because I'm still planning it alongside the storyboards. In fact, the entire point of coming up with these little bits of dialogue was so that I'd have something that I could insert into the soundtrack recording as I was roughing it out. And I got sidetracked. It happens. Part of the preparation for doing a short movie was watching a lot of cartoon shorts from the theatrical days, so I got myself the Looney Tunes Golden Collection, which I highly recommend to anyone who's interested in the form. Also because it's bloody funny. And the big revelation for me was watching all of these old shorts from the 1930s and discovering them and seeing exactly how musical and rhythmic that they were. And part of that, I think, comes from the way that they used to plan that animation out. I can't remember specifically which cartoons that I saw, but they were from the early 30s. They were made by Warner Brothers, and they were literally using musical staff sheets to plan the animation out, so there'd be so many bars at one tempo and there'd be a tempo change, and then it would change again. And the thing about musical tempo is it's predictable, so you can say, okay, something rolling along at, let's say, 120 beats per minute, that's 12 frame time, so every beat 12 frames has gone past. So knowing that, if as long as you've got as long as you have a reliable metronome, then you can synchronize music to animation, and you can sort of plan all of it, and it will work. Now, even though I would never ever in my darkest nightmares attempt to make an animated film like that, I think there's still, for me, some appeal in the processes that they used, working animation to music that's set in beats which synchronize naturally to the frames. The reason that the music isn't done yet is because I'm still gearing up to tell the story of the cartoon with the music. And to wit, I've done a couple of musical sketches, which I've included in the new soundtrack to the narration here. And the reason I'm doing it through music is because that's what I know. I'm sort of a musical person, I think, in terms of rhythms and beats. In terms of actually describing how I go through the process of making the soundtrack and matching that to the storyboard and planning all of the story out musically, I think I'll probably just do that as sort of a catch-up, the same way that I did with the character design. What I can say ahead of time is that I'm going to be doing all of the music and sound effects and sound design completely synthetically. The rationale I had was I'm going to be using synthetic light, surfaces, and air for the visual part, so I may as well use synthetic vibrations and substances and models for the auditory part. And it's actually working out pretty well. the same way that light synthesis is making leaps and bounds in the visual effects community, sound synthesis is also getting pretty advanced as well. And like in visual effects, a lot of those advances are coming to home users and sort of semi-professional users like myself. Now, I'm using open source software for the graphic side of things. So Blender I'm using for the animation, and Krita I'm using for the concept art and other stuff. This time, probably not for the last time, I'm going to be using proprietary software to do the sound. It's not necessarily the case that open source software isn't up to the task of creating the soundtrack for a short cartoon, but I did already buy all this cool software that can make awesome noises, so I may as well use it, right? Yeah. Okay, back to what's on screen. Pointy is pointing at something, as per his name. So on that second little patch of dialogue, the beats are fairly well established. It looks as though I've already lip-synced everything in. I'm not sure if I've had my rant about lip-syncing and the movie Brave by Pixar, where they were using American visemes as opposed to Scottish visemes for the characters, and that was really distracting. Completely got in the way of me enjoying that film. At any rate, you can see there that Pointy looks as though he needs to go to the toilet. He's shuffling back and forth like a crazy person, and that just won't do. So the first thing I'm getting rid of is the influence on the eye, so that the eye will always point at the camera, or it'll do its best, although it'll be interrupted somewhat by the lattice effect that's applied to the entire rig. The other thing that I'm going to get rid of is that sort of shuffle back and forth. It's kind of there to give the impression that he's moving his weight back and forth kind of impatiently on his feet. And if you've been sort of paying attention, you'll know that Pointy I should say, is a very direct character. So he wouldn't be sort of shuffling and fidgeting around. He might just sort of casually move his foot to one side to sort of take his weight, but he wouldn't be fidgeting. He's not that kind of character. He's the kind of character that would stand there and scream at you. That's the kind of character he is. So after all of this, I can see that I'm not quite as good at animating as I need to be to pull this off, and that rig is not production ready yet by a long shot. So, still lots to do. Thanks a lot for watching, I'll see you next time, and until then, have a good one. Bye.